The sky was a heavy gray that day, the kind that presses down on your shoulders and fills the air with tension before a storm. The streets of Rivertown were unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that made the occasional echo of footsteps or distant hunk of a car feel like thunder. It was just another day, or so it seemed. But for Officer Nathan Carter, a 15-year veteran of the Rivertown Police Department, and Marcus Bryant, a local teacher returning home from a long day at work, it was a day that would change everything. Nathan sat in his patrol car parked near a corner store, sipping on coffee that had long gone cold. His eyes scanned the street, not because he was looking for trouble, but because he'd been trained to do so. The small town wasn't known for much crime, but Nathan believed in staying alert. His dash cam was on, just like it was every shift, recording everything that unfolded in front of his cruiser. He didn't think much of it as he adjusted the camera earlier that morning, a routine task for a routine day. A few blocks away, Marcus walked out of the grocery store with a bag in one hand and his car keys in the other. He was a man who kept to himself, known around town for his calm demeanor and kind nature. He taught history at the local high school and often stayed late grading papers or planning lessons. Today, he was heading home earlier than usual, eager to catch up on some much-needed rest. As he walked toward his car, the faint sound of a police siren reached his ears, and for a moment, he didn't think it had anything to do with him. But Nathan had noticed Marcus the moment he exited the store. It wasn't just Marcus that caught his attention. It was the car parked nearby, an older model sedan that had been described in a report earlier that week as potentially tied to a string of thefts in the area. Nathan's training kicked in. He started his patrol car, his eyes narrowing as he carried the mic on his radio. Unit 45, possible match on the vehicle described in this week's bulletin. License plate, standby. Marcus had no idea he was being watched as he opened the door to his car and placed the grocery bag on the passenger seat. The sound of a car engine idling close by finally caught his attention, and he glanced over his shoulder. The sight of a police cruiser made his stomach drop, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he knew how quickly misunderstandings could escalate. His hands instinctively moved to his pockets to pull out his phone, a habit he developed over the years whenever he felt uneasy. The cruiser's lights flashed, and Nathan stepped out, hand resting near his holstered weapon, not drawn but ready. "Sir, can you step away from the vehicle?" Nathan called out, his tone firm but not aggressive. Marcus turned slowly, his hands visible, his heart racing as he tried to stay calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. Nathan gestured toward the car. "We have reports of a vehicle matching this description involved in suspicious activity. I need to ask you a few questions." Marcus frowned, confusion evident on his face. "This is my car. I just came from the store," he said, pointing toward the grocery bag on the seat. What neither of them realized at that moment was that the dash cam in Nathan's car was recording everything. Every word, every movement, every detail. And what it would later reveal was something no one could have anticipated. As Marcus tried to explain his situation, the interaction became increasingly tense. Nathan's suspicions grew not because of anything Marcus said or did, but because of the assumptions swirling in his mind. The quiet street, the matching vehicle, the nervous energy, they all seemed to line up, at least in Nathan's eyes. Marcus, on the other hand, felt the weight of a history he couldn't escape, the unspoken tension that so often accompanied encounters like this one. The scene played out with a strange sense of inevitability. Voices were raised and movements became more animated, but the pivotal moment, the one that would later shock everyone, came when Nathan reached for his radio to call for backup. In the split second that followed, something happened that neither man could have foreseen, something the dash cam would capture in stark, undeniable clarity. And it was in that moment that the story truly began. The silence that followed Nathan's radio call was sharp and heavy, broken only by the faint crackle of static. Marcus stood frozen beside his car, hands raised slightly in a gesture meant to communicate compliance. His mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. He had seen situations like this before, not personally, but in the news, in viral videos that often ended in tragedy. He told himself to stay calm, to be cooperative, but it was hard to ignore the knot of fear twisting tighter in his chest. Nathan, meanwhile, was watching Marcus closely, his instincts in overdrive. He didn't know this man, but years on the force had taught him to trust his gut. Something felt off, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. Was it the way Marcus had reacted when he approached? Or was it just the lingering tension that came with being a cop in times when trust in law enforcement was at an all-time low? Whatever it was, Nathan felt the familiar weight of responsibility pressing down on him. As he waited for backup, Nathan decided to dig deeper. "Sir," he said, his tone measured, "do you have any ID on you?" Marcus hesitated, his fingers twitching at his sides. "It's in my wallet," he said carefully. "May I reach for it?" Nathan nodded, watching Marcus like a hawk as he slowly retrieved his wallet from his back pocket and handed over his driver's license. Nathan examined the ID, cross-referencing it with the car's registration details. Everything seemed to check out, but the uneasy feeling in his gut remained. He couldn't shake the idea that something about the situation wasn't right. "What were you doing at the store?" he asked, his tone still professional but tinged with suspicion. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his confusion evident. "Buying groceries," he replied, nodding toward the bag in his car. "Is that a crime now?" The words hung in the air, sharp and pointed. Nathan shifted his weight, trying to decide how to respond. Before he could, the faint hum of another siren cut through the quiet, growing louder as a second patrol car pulled onto the scene. Officer Lisa Ramirez stepped out, her expression calm but curious. She had worked with Nathan for years and trusted his instincts, but as she approached, a gaze flicked between him and Marcus, assessing the situation for herself. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice low enough that only Nathan could hear. "Possible match on the car from this week's bulletin," he replied. "Driver claims it's his and that he just came from the store. I'm still verifying." Lisa glanced at Marcus, who stood stiffly by his car, his eyes darting between the two officers. Something about his posture struck her. He didn't look like a man trying to hide something. He looked like a man trying not to be misunderstood. As Nathan continued his questioning, Lisa's attention shifted to the grocery bag on the front seat. She leaned in slightly, peering through the window. The bag held a few basic items: bread, milk, some fruit. It wasn't much, but it didn't scream suspicious. Still, protocol was protocol, and Lisa knew better than to make assumptions. "Mind if we take a look inside the car?" Nathan asked, his eyes locked on Marcus. Marcus hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Do I have a choice?" he asked quietly. Nathan nodded. "You do. But if you refuse, it might look like you're hiding something." Marcus exhaled slowly, weighing his options. He knew his rights, but he also knew how quickly a refusal could escalate the situation. "Go ahead," he said finally, stepping back. Nathan and Lisa began their search, moving methodically through the car. The dash cam recorded everything, capturing their movements, the quiet murmurs of their conversation, and Marcus standing a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. The tension in the air was almost unbearable, a tightrope stretched to its limit. But the car was clean. No stolen goods, no suspicious items, nothing that tied Marcus to the thefts Nathan was investigating. Nathan's brow furrowed as he closed the trunk. "Nothing here," he admitted reluctantly. Lisa nodded, her expression neutral. "Seems that way." Marcus felt a flicker of relief, but didn't let his guard down. "Are we done here?" he asked, his voice firm but not confrontational. Nathan hesitated, glancing at Lisa. He hated the feeling of being wrong, but he couldn't justify holding Marcus any longer. "For now," he said, stepping back. "But if we find anything that connects you to..." "Connects me to what?" Marcus interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "I'm a teacher. I spend my days grading papers and helping kids learn about history. I don't know what you're looking for, but it's not here." Nathan opened his mouth to respond, but Lisa held up a hand, silently urging him to stop. "We're just doing our job," she said, her tone gentler than Nathan's. "Thank you for your cooperation." Marcus shook his head, his frustration clear. "Doing your job," he repeated under his breath. "Right." He climbed into his car, slamming the door behind him. The engine roared to life, and within moments he was gone, leaving Nathan and Lisa standing in the street. Lisa turned to Nathan, her arms crossed. "You sure about this?" she asked. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like we just wasted time harassing an innocent man." Nathan didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing, replaying the encounter over and over. Something still didn't sit right with him, but he couldn't explain why. "Maybe," he admitted finally, "but I'd rather be sure than overlook something." Lisa sighed, shaking her head. "Just make sure you're not letting your gut cloud your judgment," she said. "We have to be better than that." As they returned to their patrol cars, the dash cam continued recording, capturing every word, every gesture, every lingering look. What none of them realized was that the real story was still unfolding, just out of sight. And when the truth finally came to light, it would leave everyone questioning everything they thought they knew. The quiet of the evening wrapped around Rivertown like a blanket. but Marcus's mind was anything but calm as he drove away from the scene. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel, tension radiating through his whole body. He replayed the encounter in his head, each question, each movement, every flicker of suspicion in the officer's eyes. It was a scene he had seen too many times in too many different places, and yet it felt just as unsettling every time. Pulling into his driveway, Marcus sat in the car for a moment, staring at the familiar outline of his small, tidy home. The groceries sat on the seat beside him, untouched. With a sigh, he grabbed the bag and made his way inside, locking the door behind him as if it could keep the day's events at bay. He tried to shake it off to focus on the stack of essays waiting for him on the dining table, but the unease lingered, heavy and insistent. Across town, Nathan sat in his patrol car, staring out into the night. Lisa's words echoed in his mind. Make sure you're not letting your gut cloud your judgment. He wanted to believe he had done the right thing, that he had followed protocol and acted on credible information. But a nagging doubt tugged at him. What if he had gotten it wrong? What if Marcus really was just a man trying to go about his day? Nathan decided to review the dash cam footage, hoping it would provide clarity. He parked in a quiet lot and pulled up the video on his in-car system, watching the interaction play out frame by frame. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Marcus's movements were calm, his answers straightforward. But as Nathan watched, something caught his eye, something he hadn't noticed in the moment. It wasn't Marcus who seemed suspicious. It was the car itself. Nathan paused the footage, zooming in on the passenger side window. A faint smudge of something on the glass, a fingerprint, maybe, caught the light at a certain angle. It was barely visible, but it stood out to Nathan now. He replayed the footage, his eyes narrowing as he studied the car more closely. The smudge wasn't enough to prove anything, but it planted a seed of doubt in Nathan's mind. If Marcus wasn't involved, could someone else have been using his car without his knowledge? Meanwhile, Lisa had returned to the station and was finishing up her shift. She noticed Nathan hadn't come back yet, and a part of her was tempted to call him, to tell him to let it go. But she knew Nathan. He was stubborn, driven by a need to get to the bottom of things. It was one of the reasons she respected him, even if it sometimes led him down the wrong path. Back at Marcus's house, the night wore on. He tried to focus on grading papers, but his thoughts kept drifting. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. It was a text from his sister, Simone. "You okay? Heard about the cops pulling you over. What happened?" Marcus hesitated before responding. He didn't want to worry her, but he also didn't want to brush it off. "Just a misunderstanding. They thought my car was involved in something. It's fine now." Simone's reply was immediate. "Fine. You sure about that? These things have a way of coming back." Marcus frowned, her words striking a chord. He had always admired Simone's ability to see things others missed, but tonight he wished she could be wrong. As midnight approached, a new thread in the story began to unravel. Unbeknownst to Marcus, his car had been flagged earlier in the week after being spotted near a break-in at a local electronics store. Surveillance footage showed a car of the same make and model speeding away from the scene, but the plates had been obscured. The report had been sent out to patrol units, and Nathan had been on high alert ever since. What no one realized, however, was that the real culprit had gone to great lengths to avoid detection. Earlier that day, while Marcus was at work, someone had used a duplicate key to access his car. It was a subtle operation, quick, quiet, and efficient. The thief had parked it near the store during the break-in, knowing it would throw off investigators if the vehicle was seen again. The thief, a man named Daryl Kane, was a local with a reputation for staying one step ahead of the law. He had been watching Marcus for weeks, noting his routine and carefully planning his moves. He knew Marcus wouldn't notice anything out of the ordinary, just a smudge on the window, a slightly off-kilter rearview mirror. Daryl was careful, almost obsessively so, and he was confident that his plan was foolproof. But he hadn't counted on Nathan's persistence or Marcus's growing unease. The pieces were starting to come together, though no one could see the full picture yet. Nathan decided to run a deeper check on Marcus's car, looking for any previous incidents or irregularities. It was a long shot, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. At the same time, Marcus found himself unable to sleep. He sat on his couch, scrolling through his phone, searching for answers to questions he couldn't quite articulate. He read articles about wrongful accusations, about people who had been caught in the crossfire of assumptions and misunderstandings. The stories hit too close to home, and he felt a knot of fear and frustration tighten in his chest. As the clock struck 2 in the morning, Nathan's search turned up something unusual. A report from 3 months ago mentioned a car matching Marcus being spotted near another break-in, though no charges had been filed. The connection was tenuous, but it was enough to keep Nathan digging. He decided to visit the electronics store the next day, hoping to review their surveillance footage for any leads. The stage was set, the players in position, each unaware of how their paths would intersect again. Marcus, Nathan, Lisa, and even Daryl, each of them carried a piece of the puzzle, but the picture was far from complete. And as the night deepened, the tension simmered, waiting for the moment when it would all come to a head. The morning air was crisp and cool as Marcus stepped out of his house, still carrying the weight of the previous day's encounter. His mind churned with questions, but he tried to push them aside. He needed to focus on the students, on their essays and questions about history, not the uncomfortable reality he had faced just hours ago. He climbed into his car, taking a deep breath before starting the engine, determined to keep the day uneventful. Across town, Nathan was already at the electronics store, standing with the manager as they reviewed the surveillance footage from the break-in. The grainy video played on the small monitor, showing a figure in a hooded jacket moving quickly through the aisles. In the background, a car idled briefly outside the store, just long enough for the thief to escape. Nathan leaned closer to the screen, his eyes narrowing. He could make out the shape of the car, an exact match to Marcus's. The same model, the same color, but something felt off. He rewound the footage, watching the car again. The way it moved, the timing, it didn't feel like Marcus. "Can you zoom in on the license plate?" Nathan asked. The manager shook his head. "Too blurry," he said, "but it looks like someone tried to cover it up with something." Nathan frowned. His suspicion about the smudge on Marcus' car window resurfaced, but it wasn't enough to go on. He needed more. At school, Marcus was halfway through his first class when he noticed a patrol car idling in the parking lot. His stomach dropped. The sight brought back the anxiety from the day before, making it hard to concentrate. His students picked up on his unease, their curious glances only adding to his discomfort. When the bell rang, Marcus stepped into the hallway and pulled out his phone, texting Simon. "Police are here again. I think they're watching me." Her reply came quickly. "They won't stop until they find something, or make something up. Be careful." Marcus slipped his phone back into his pocket, his nerves fraying. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being cornered, bit by bit, with no clear way out. Meanwhile, Nathan sat in his patrol car, reviewing the footage again on his tablet. Something wasn't adding up. Marcus' reaction during the traffic stop didn't match the behavior of someone involved in a crime. He was too calm, too cooperative. Nathan couldn't help but wonder if he had been looking at the wrong person all along. But if Marcus wasn't involved, then who was? As the day wore on, Nathan's determination grew. He decided to check with the department's forensic team about the smudge on Marcus' car window. Maybe it was nothing, but if there was even a chance it could lead to answers, he had to pursue it. The team agreed to take a look, and Nathan left the car with them, feeling the first flicker of hope that he might get closer to the truth. While Nathan waited, Lisa paid a visit to Marcus's school. She wanted to follow up, not as an enforcer, but as someone who could see the strain in his eyes during the stop. She found him in the teacher's lounge, sitting at a table with his head in his hands. When she approached, he looked up, his expression guarded. "I'm not here to question you," Lisa said gently. "I just wanted to check in. Yesterday was a lot." Marcus studied her for a moment before nodding. "It was," he said. "I can't stop thinking about it. It's like I'm guilty until proven innocent." Lisa hesitated, unsure of what to say. She had seen the flaws in the system before, the way biases and assumptions could cloud judgment. "Sometimes we get it wrong," she admitted. "But I promise you, there are people trying to get it right." Marcus looked away, his jaw tightening. "I hope you're one of them," he said quietly. That evening, the forensic team called Nathan with their findings. The smudge on Marcus' car window wasn't just a random mark. It was a partial fingerprint. It wasn't enough for a solid match, but it was enough to send Nathan digging through records. When he finally found a possible match, his blood ran cold. Daryl Kane, a known thief with a history of using other people's vehicles to cover his tracks. Nathan's heart pounded as he pieced it together. Daryl must have used Marcus's car, knowing it would shift the focus away from himself. And if that was true, Marcus was being dragged into something he had nothing to do with. Nathan felt a surge of urgency. He needed to find Daryl before this spiraled any further. But Daryl was already moving. He had been watching Marcus, ensuring his plan stayed on track. When he saw Nathan's patrol car parked near Marcus's neighborhood, He knew his window was closing. It was time to act. The stage was set, the tension thick as night fell over Rivertown. Marcus, unaware of the danger looming closer, sat in his living room, grading papers and trying to quiet his restless thoughts. Nathan, now racing against time, called Lisa, filling her in on the discovery. And Daryl, lurking in the shadows, prepared to make his next move. Every piece was in motion, and the collision was inevitable. The night air felt heavier than usual as Marcus sat in his living room, the quiet around him amplifying every small creak of the house. He had tried to focus on his work, on the neat lines of his students' handwriting and the red marks of his corrections, but his mind kept drifting. There was a tension in the air he couldn't explain, a feeling that something was just out of place. The uneasy calm made him glance toward the window more often than he realized, his eyes catching every flicker of movement outside. Unbeknownst to Marcus, Daryl Kane was closer than he could have imagined. Parked a few houses down, Daryl watched Marcus's home from his car, his eyes sharp and calculating. He had a plan, one that involved tying up any loose ends before Nathan or anyone else could connect the dots. Marcus was an unknowing pawn in his scheme, and Daryl wasn't about to let him ruin what had been, so far, a perfectly executed cover. Meanwhile, Nathan was speeding through Rivertown's dimly lit streets, his phone pressed to his ear. "Lisa, I've got a name," he said, his voice taut with urgency. "Daryl Kane. He's been using Marcus's car to cover his tracks. I don't know how he got access, but I think he's still watching him." Lisa's response was immediate. "We need to move. If Kane knows we're onto him, he might do something desperate." Nathan felt a pang of guilt as he thought about Marcus, who had been caught in the middle of this mess for no reason. "I'm heading to Marcus' house now," Nathan said. "Call it in and get backup on the way." As Nathan drove, Marcus finally decided to call it a night. He stacked the papers neatly on the table and stretched, his muscles tight from hours of sitting. He checked the locks on the doors out of habit, his mind briefly flashing to the police cars that had shadowed him earlier in the day. Shaking his head, he told himself he was being paranoid. Still, he couldn't shake the lingering unease. Daryl's patience was wearing thin as he watched Marcus move through the house. He had intended to stay out of sight, to keep his distance until the heat died down, but with Nathan piecing everything together, he didn't have the luxury of waiting anymore. Grabbing a pair of gloves from the passenger seat, Daryl made his move, slipping out of the car and into the shadows. Nathan pulled up to Marcus's neighborhood just as Daryl reached the back fence of Marcus's property. He parked a few houses away, not wanting to draw attention, and stepped out, his eyes scanning the quiet street. Something felt off. Too still, too quiet. He reached for his radio, alerting dispatch of his location before heading toward Marcus's house. Inside, Marcus was pouring himself a glass of water when a faint sound made him freeze. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, the creak of wood, maybe, or the rustle of leaves, but it was enough to send a chill down his spine. He set the glass down slowly, his ears straining for another sound. The seconds stretched on, the silence pressing down like a weight. Then it happened again, a faint, deliberate sound, this time closer. Marcus's heart pounded as he grabbed his phone, his hands trembling. He hesitated for a moment before dialing Simon. She picked up after the first ring, her voice filled with concern. "Marcus, what's wrong?" "I think someone's outside," he whispered, moving toward the front door. Simon's voice sharpened. "Call the police. Now." Marcus nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I will," he said. "Just stay on the line." But before he could make the call, a loud knock on the door made him jump. He turned, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, he thought it might be the police, but something about the knock felt wrong. Too forceful, too urgent. "Marcus, don't open it," Simon said, her voice almost pleading. "I want," he whispered, backing away from the door. Outside, Nathan approached the house cautiously, his hand hovering near his holster. He spotted the faint outline of a figure near the back of the house and felt his adrenaline spike. It was Daryl. Nathan could see him clearly now, moving toward a side window with calculated precision. Nathan reached for his radio. "I've got eyes on Kane," he said quietly. "He's trying to get into the house. I need backup now." Inside, Marcus's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Seeing the unknown number, he hesitated before answering. "Hello." "Marcus, it's Officer Taylor," Nathan said quickly. "I'm outside your house. Stay where you are, lock all the doors, and don't open the door for anyone. Do you understand?" Marcus's pulse raced as he nodded, his voice barely steady. "Okay." Nathan moved closer to the house, his steps silent as he tried to position himself between Daryl and the window. Daryl, unaware that Nathan was closing in, pulled a crowbar from his bag, his movements deliberate. Just as he raised it toward the window, Nathan shouted, "Police, drop the weapon and put your hands where I can see them." Daryl froze for a split second before bolting, the crowbar clattering to the ground. Nathan pursued him, his heart pounding as they raced through the yard. The sound of sirens in the distance signaled that backup was on its way, but Nathan knew he couldn't let Daryl step away. Inside, Marcus could hear the commotion, his fear mounting as he tried to make sense of what was happening. The sound of running footsteps, the distant wail of sirens, it all blurred together, leaving him with more questions than answers. Outside, the chase reached its peak as Daryl turned a corner, disappearing into the shadows. Nathan skidded to a stop, his eyes darting in every direction. The night seemed to close in around him, the tension reaching a breaking point.